the fact that people don't talk about it and don't want to express the feelings is really part of the difficulty. I think, any time we have a significant loss, we're going to grieve. Loss is defined as when you're deprived of something or someone that you cared about and that was valuable to you. So you lose someone by death, you lose someone to an illness, you lose a job. Any loss causes grief, because grief is a reaction to any significant loss. And one of the most important things I try to say to people is this, that grief is not a sign of weakness. Grief is a sign that we cared.
I need you to say that again, because that was really, really powerful.
Grief is not a sign of weakness. Grief is a sign that we cared. Have you noticed how often when someone gets emotional, oh, I'm emotional, I'm sorry. And where did we get the idea that we had to apologize for our emotions? Queen Elizabeth once famously said, grief is the price we pay for love. So anytime people feel something, there's different kinds of emotions.
Sure.
And I'm absolutely convinced that there's not really grief emotions and good emotions. There's positive emotions, because the word emotion in French can mean to be excited. So you go to a soccer game, a football game, sorry, forgive me.
There you go.
You go to a football game and you see excited people.
Sure.
Nobody criticizes that.
True.
But when we go to a funeral, we say things like, well, now you got to be strong. You got to pull yourself together. You mustn't be emotional. Or the ultimate guilt trip, your loved one wouldn't want you to cry.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to think after I'm gone, someone will care enough about me to shed a tear.
That's true.
And I think the most important thing we can do for grieving people is to validate the fact that grief isn't a sickness or a disease or a mental health disorder, as it's sometimes defined in our society. Grief is a normal reaction to what is always an unwelcome event.
An unwelcome event. I'm so glad you said what you did, because when my dad died, I even had to think about, the date all the time. And I think I said this earlier, it was 2008, but was it not? It's like, I know I need to remember, but part of my brain doesn't want to remember because of the pain associated with that.
That's exactly right. These are known as avoidance behaviors.
That's a natural thing.
It's a natural thing.
Wow.
That's right, because so often after a death, the things you'll hear people say is, I can't believe it. It just seems so unreal. Is this really happening? And that's our defense mechanism. Because often after a death, we don't feel emotional. I mean, how many times have you gone to a funeral and you see people, you're expecting it to be on the floor in grief, and actually they're doing quite well. Oh, you're doing so well. You're really strong. You're really handling it. It's not that they're strong. Of course they're strong. To stand on your 2 feet at a time like that, you're strong. It's the fact that we're numb. We're in shock.
Yeah.
And we just can't believe it because we don't want to believe it. And it takes our defense mechanism a long time for it to filter through to the place where we can say, yeah, this is real. And I have to confront how my life is different.
This is, I know people who are watching this are receiving something. I definitely am. And it's kind of taking me back. So I remember at the moment when my dad passed, there was a lot of emotion. There's a lot of, weeping, and then it stopped, and then you kick into administrative mode. Okay, who are going to be the pallbearers, and what are we going to print the bulletins, and who's going to say the prayer? And you go into this mode. Is that healthy to kind of delay the grief until you can deal with it, or is that just natural?
I really believe, Joe, that people need to do what they need to do.
Okay.
Because yes, there's the initial shock, the impact of what has happened, but then, the busyness and stuff. What surprises people is that sometimes it's a few months after the death, or 6 months down the road, and all of a sudden, boom, the reality. And the difficulty is people who saw them at the time of the funeral, oh, you're doing well, you're strong, are now saying, well, gee, what's wrong with you? We thought you were doing so well. And then people have to pretend because they think, well, I'm not doing as well as I was expected. I'm not getting over it in 3 months and all this kind of thing. And that's where our support programs come in, to sort of validate and legitimize that this is a process. This is a journey that people are on. And when people ask me, how long does grief last? my answer is, it always takes longer than people who haven't been through it seem to think. And I think that's as good as you can go, because there's no one neat timeline for grief. Grief comes and goes. comes at birthdays and Christmas and anniversaries and these kinds of things.
The first year, right?
All the firsts. That's exactly right.
My goodness, as you're talking, I'm going back, it was almost 6 months to the day after my dad died that I had my first cry. And I was at a drive-through in Tim Hortons, and I don't know what happened. All of a sudden it hit me. It's like, he's gone. And then I didn't know how to process it because I'm like, well, why haven't I been crying for 6 months? What kind of a son doesn't cry for his father? And you kind of have this guilt. And then along the journey, sometimes people say things, and I think they're well-meaning.
Yeah.
Like my dad worked in a window factory, Bill, for 30 years, and somebody said to me, oh, the Lord needed your dad. I said, what, to caulk windows? Like, just say sorry for your loss. Like, what do you do when people say that kind of stuff?
Well, I would think as a person who worked with windows, that would have been a real pain.
Oh.
But no, you see, I think, look, I like to believe that people mean well. But the problem is they don't know what to say, they don't know what to do, and so they come up with cliches.
That's true.
Maybe it's a blessing in disguise, or maybe they're in a better place and stuff. Cliches are an attempt to bring meaning to a situation to the grieving person just doesn't make any sense. So it's a waste of time. And I think that people, again, people mean well. This is not an indictment on anybody.
Yes.
They mean well.
Yeah.
But sometimes they say things that just aren't helpful. And that then the grieving person closes up. And so I think we have to be, I like to tell my students, if you're talking more than the grieving person, you're not being as helpful as you think. So
that's great.
I think listening and being there for them and not having advice. Because advice applies. If I'm giving you advice, I'm telling you what's meaningful for me, not necessarily for you. I have to find out what's meaningful, and that's a much more effective way of dealing with grieving people.
Oh, this is so helpful. I know there's people watching this right now saying, oh, I wish I would have known this 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and I'm so glad you're sharing this. What about people who go through, what's the word, almost like a survivor's guilt? They play the what if game, or what if I had called them, or what if I had been driving, or what if I had done this? Like, people struggle with that guilt. How do you deal with that?
I think guilt is a topic all by itself. And I think guilt is actually one of the most useless and counterproductive emotions in the whole basket of emotions. Guilt says, I could have done something.
Right.
If only I'd done this. What if I'd done something different? What if I'd done more? But here's the problem. When you've done everything for someone you care about, you always wish you could have done more. So in many ways, guilt is a setup. People would rather feel guilty than feel helpless. Because after a death, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
But we don't like that. We like to be in control, and we like to feel that, hey, I could do something to change this. And it's ultimately when, we come to the place where we realize there's nothing more that I can do. Well, maybe. As you know, I lost my son 5 years ago. And you lost your dad in 2008. And people would say, well, come on, Bill, 5 years. Come on, Joe.
Yeah.
That's right. You ought to be over it. But you don't get over it. You get through it. But here's the point. I think it's very important to understand that people only want one thing. A grieving person only wants one thing. And this is the reason why they get angry with other people. This is why we have to tolerate angry responses. The one thing a grieving person wants, they want their loved one back.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that we can't do. But here's the point, I think. In a situation where there's nothing you can do, what can you do? I think you have to make a choice. Is my life going to go on? My son, his daughter was 4 years old when he died. She's now 9. And she's the light of my life. I'm going to do everything I can for her.
Yeah.
Because it's the right thing to do, because it's also what he would want me to do. Because that would be, he'd say, Dad, make sure you look after her. And so I think we make a choice. Things happen in life that are tragic. Things happen in life that are not good. But we come to a place where we have to decide, this may not be good. This will surprise you. Please hear me out.
Yeah.
God doesn't give anyone a good life. I believe with all my heart that God gives us a life. But sometimes tragedy comes along. We say, well, where's God in the midst of the tragedy? Bad things happen to good people.
Absolutely.
A good life is not defined by the life that's given to us. A good life is defined by what we do with the life we've been given.
Yeah.
So I lost my wife in 1983. I lost my son in 2018, and many other losses. We've all had losses. But it comes down to the question, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to decide to do now that this has happened? And that, I think, becomes the key.
You know, I feel blessed that I can have this, conversation with you and, ask questions that, I need answered because I know it's reflective of other people who are watching. But you've been able to develop a course on grief to help people on the journey. Tell us a little bit about the course and how people can access it. I think it's important.
After my wife died, I went back to the University of Toronto and did my doctoral work, and I developed a model of community grief support. There's a lot of grief counselors out there now. There weren't any grief counselors even back in the 80s.
Oh, wow.
And grief counselors have a very important and valuable contribution to make. But it can be expensive, and a lot of people can't afford professional help. So we've developed a model of grief support that basically I've put my program into 12 30-minute videos.
Okay.
And I've found a sponsor in Arbor Memorial who are taking this right across the country and offering it to churches and to community groups and to anyone who can use it in the communities across the country. And it's offered at no cost.
Wow.
No cost. Because I really believe that the last thing people need after a significant loss is to have to put out money to get the help that they need. And I also believe that there's great power in people coming together in friendship, certainly in understanding and in support and these kinds of things. But now, for goodness sake, don't tell my sponsors this. The real magic isn't in Bill Webster's videos. The real magic is in the fact that the videos create an atmosphere in which people can talk together.
Yes.
One-on-one. I mean, you and I have had a lovely conversation here, and it's been helpful for both of us in our loss. Mr. Rogers once famously said, anything that is mentionable is manageable. I think that's a great principle. Anything that's mentionable is manageable, but we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
You see, we don't know what to say, we don't know what to do. The only mistake we can make is not talking about it, because that which cannot be put into words cannot be put to rest.